The silence of 3 a.m. was a physical weight, thick and suffocating, broken only by a small wet cough from the other room. Helen lay rigid in her bed, the springs groaning with every shallow breath she took. She didn't need to see. She could feel the geography of her despair. She could feel the chill of the bare floorboards through the thin mattress, smell the faint, sour scent of sickness on the air, and hear a sound that tore her apart. The rasping cough of her 1-year-old daughter, Sophie. Her heart didn't just ache, it felt like a cold, heavy stone lodged in her chest. Beside her, her 10-year-old son, Luke, shifted in his sleep, a small whimper escaping his lips. He was trying to be brave for her, she knew, but fear seeped out of him in his dreams. Sleep was a luxury she hadn't afforded in weeks. Every cough, every creak of the old apartment building was a fresh spike of adrenaline. She felt the exhaustion in her bones, a deep cellular weariness, but her mind was a frantic storm of numbers and fears, a prison with no escape. On the rickety kitchen table, beneath the light of a single, flickering street lamp, lay her entire world. 2 worn $10 bills, 1 $5, 2 singles, and a small, sad pile of coins, $27.14. She had counted it a dozen times, as if repetition could magically alter the sum. Her fingers, calloused from years of pushing fabric through a sewing machine, trembled as she touched the eviction notice tucked beside the money. The paper felt unnaturally cold, its printed words a death sentence. Vacate by Friday. Friday was 2 days away. The number mocked her. Not enough for Sophie's medicine, not enough for a single bag of groceries, barely enough for a gallon of milk. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. Her stomach, already hollow with a hunger she ignored, clenched into a tight, painful knot. The world had shrunk to this single, terrifying equation: $27 versus the gaping maw of homelessness and a sick child's needs. It was an impossible problem, and she was failing. Only a month ago, there had been the steady, comforting hum of the garment factory, the smell of steam and fresh-cut cloth, the rhythm of her work, the one thing she could control. Then the silence. The owner, his face pale and his voice hollow, had gathered them in the echoing space. "Bankrupt," he had said. The word was a gunshot. "We're closing the gates today." Just like that. Her hands, which could mend any tear and create beauty from scraps, were suddenly useless. Now, she would sometimes sit in the dark and touch the cold, silent metal of her sewing machine, a relic from a life that no longer existed. It was a cruel monument to her own obsolescence. She had been a seamstress, she had been a provider, she had been a wife, before the sudden illness took her husband 2 years ago. Now, she felt like a ghost, a collection of past identities with no present and a terrifyingly blank future. The floor had dropped out from under her, and she was still falling, the abyss endless and dark. She could hear the city's distant, uncaring rumble, a world moving on without her. In this small third-floor apartment, time had stopped, frozen in a state of suspended panic. She looked at Luke, his face so much like his father's, and a fresh wave of guilt washed over her. He deserved scraped knees from playing outside, not the gnawing anxiety of an empty pantry. He deserved a warm bed, not the constant threat of a cold street. She closed her eyes, and the images came unbidden. Her children shivering in a shelter, their small faces pale with hunger, their eyes asking a question she could not answer. "Where do we go, Mum?" The question echoed in the hollows of her mind. There was no one to call. Her parents were long gone, and her husband's family had faded away after the funeral. She was an island, and the tide was rising, fast. The water was already at her neck, cold and paralyzing. This wasn't just hardship. This was the end of the line, a precipice from which she could see no way back. Sophie coughed again, a longer, more painful-sounding spasm that ended in a weak, fretful cry. The sound sliced through Helen's paralysis. It was a sound that demanded action, but her body felt leaden, pinned down by the sheer weight of her powerlessness. She was a mother, a protector, and she couldn't protect them. The feeling was a physical violation, a hollowing out of her very soul. She pressed her palms against her eyes, not to stop tears, she was too empty for tears, but to physically hold her head together, to stop it from shattering into a million pieces. A tremor ran through her entire body, a silent scream of pure, primal fear. In the absolute darkness of her room, with nothing but the sound of her daughter's illness and the cold reality of her poverty, she was utterly, completely alone. What would you do if you were in her place, with the clock ticking and your children's future hanging by a single, fraying thread? If you believe in the power of a mother's will to survive, subscribe to our channel and follow Helen's journey. The letter arrived on Wednesday, a thin beige envelope that seemed out of place among the final utility bills and junk mail. Helen's fingers, numb with cold and anxiety, fumbled to open it. The paper inside was crisp, official, and smelled faintly of a clean, sterile office, a scent from another universe. The words swam before her eyes, a jumble of legal jargon she couldn't immediately process. Last will and testament, Zelda May Forrester, great aunt. The name was a distant echo from her childhood, a woman she'd never met, a ghost in family stories. The letter stated she was the sole beneficiary of an inheritance, a property, a small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. The words hung in the air, weightless and unreal. A property, a roof, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks, so fragile it was almost painful, sparked in the cold cavern of her chest. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was the possibility of hope, a concept so foreign it felt like a dream she was about to wake from. Her hands trembled as she used her last few dollars in coins at the corner payphone, the receiver cold and greasy against her ear. The lawyer's voice on the other end was dry, impersonal, confirming the details. "Yes, Mrs. Miller, the property is yours, free and clear, a small cabin on a plot of land. It was your great-aunt Zelda's wish." Helen's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat. She asked about its condition, her voice a small, wavering thing. The lawyer paused. "The records are old. It's been unoccupied for some time. It's rural. Very rural." The words were a caution, but Helen heard only the confirmation. A roof, a place to go, a place that wasn't the street. She felt a wave of lightheadedness, a dizzying vertigo as the world tilted on its axis. The wail of a distant siren was suddenly muted. The grinding city noise faded into a hum. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a single, clear path appeared through the suffocating fog of her despair. It felt like a sign, a divine intervention, a hand reaching down to pull her from the abyss. The decision was made before she even hung up the phone. There was no other choice. That night, she sold her sewing machine. The transaction felt like a betrayal, like selling a part of her own body. The $60 the pawnshop owner slid across the counter felt both like a fortune and an insult. Her hands, which knew the machine's every gear and tremor, now clutched the cold cash that would be their ticket out. She explained it to Luke, her voice tight with forced cheerfulness. "We're going on an adventure, sweetie, to a little house in the mountains, our own house." He looked at her, his 10-year-old eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and the deep, weary understanding of a child who had seen too much. He just nodded, his trust in her a sharp, painful sting. She packed their world into 2 cardboard boxes and a threadbare suitcase. The sound of packing tape being stretched and torn was the sound of her burning the last bridge to her old life. Every item she packed, a chipped mug, Luke's worn teddy bear, Sophie's baby blanket, was a prayer. The Greyhound station was a chaotic symphony of human desperation. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, stale coffee, and unwashed bodies. Helen held Sophie tight against her chest, the baby's small, unwarm weight a fragile anchor in the swirling current of people coming and going. She felt invisible, another anonymous face in the crowd of the displaced and the hopeful. The hiss of the bus's air brakes was a starting gun for her new life. Finding their seats, she sank into the worn vinyl, the exhaustion of the past weeks finally crashing down on her. As the bus lurched out of the city, the familiar, grim skyline gave way to endless stretches of highway. The rhythmic thrum of the wheels on the asphalt was a monotonous lullaby. Luke pressed his face to the glass, watching the world blur by, while Helen watched him, her heart a tangled mess of terror and fierce, protective love. She had gambled everything on this. The $60 were gone, spent on one-way tickets to a place she'd never seen, based on the name of a woman she'd never known. There was no going back now. Hours bled into one another, a smear of grey highway and monotonous green landscapes. The sun rose and set outside the grimy bus window. Sophie was fitful, her small cries cutting through the drone of the engine, earning them annoyed glances from other passengers. Helen felt a hot flush of shame, whispering apologies into the stale air. She rocked her daughter, humming softly, feeling the familiar knot of helplessness tighten in her stomach. Luke had fallen silent. The initial excitement of the journey worn away, replaced by a quiet, listless boredom. He'd occasionally ask, "Are we there yet?" And Helen would force a smile, her voice thin. "Almost? Honey, almost." She doled out their meager snacks, crackers and a shared bottle of water, making each bite last. The hunger in her own stomach was a dull, constant ache she had learned to ignore. The journey was stripping her down, peeling away the last vestiges of her identity as a capable adult, leaving only the raw, desperate core of a mother trying to survive one more hour, one more mile. As the bus climbed higher into the winding roads of West Virginia, the landscape changed. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, then to the imposing ancient shoulders of the Appalachian Mountains. The air that hissed from the bus vents seemed to grow cooler, thinner. Helen saw small towns nestled in valleys, houses with smoke curling from their chimneys, and a profound sense of isolation began to creep into her heart. This was a different kind of world, quiet and slow, a stark contrast to the relentless energy of the city she had fled. The hope that had sustained her through the grueling journey began to feel fragile again, tinged with a new anxiety. The lawyer's words echoed in her mind. Very rural. What did that truly mean? She imagined a quaint cottage, simple but sturdy, a garden she could plant, a place of peace. She clung to this image with a desperate tenacity, painting it in her mind to ward off the encroaching shadows of doubt. Her entire future, her children's future, rested on this one fragile picture. It had to be real. The bus pulled over at a lonely crossroads, marked only by a faded sign and a small gravel pull-off. "Hollow Creek Road," the driver called out, his voice thick with boredom. "This is you." Helen's stomach lurched. There was no station, no town, not even a single building in sight, just the road disappearing into a dense wall of trees, a cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through her exhaustion. She gathered her children and their meager belongings, her movements stiff and clumsy. The bus doors hissed shut behind them with a sense of finality, and the roar of its engine faded down the mountain, leaving them enveloped in a sudden, shocking silence. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled of damp earth and pine. It was a silence so deep it seemed to have a sound of its own, a low, humming emptiness. Luke huddled closer to her, his small hand gripping her coat. "Mom, where's the house?" Helen looked at the dirt track snaking into the woods, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of fear. "It's up here, honey. We just have to walk a little way." The dirt track was more of a scar on the land, rutted and overgrown. Helen shifted Sophie's weight on her hip, the baby now heavy as lead, and grabbed the handle of the suitcase. The cardboard boxes were awkward and dug into her sides. Every step was a struggle. The woods pressed in on them, the trees tall and dark, their branches interlocking overhead to block out the sky. The only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps on fallen leaves, the strained whistle of Helen's own breathing, and the distant, lonely call of a bird. The cheerful image of a quaint cottage was dissolving with every painful step, replaced by a primal fear of the isolation. They were utterly alone. No cars, no houses, no signs of life. The lawyer had said it was rural, but this was something else. This was abandonment. A half-hour of walking turned into an hour. Luke, exhausted, began to cry silently, tears tracking through the grime on his cheeks. Helen felt her own resolve begin to crumble, the false hope she'd nurtured now a bitter taste in her mouth. And then they saw it. Through a break in the trees, in a small overgrown clearing stood the cabin. The word cabin was a generous term. The sight of it stopped Helen dead in her tracks. The air left her lungs in a quiet, devastated gasp. It was a skeleton, a ruin, a monument to decay. One side of the tin roof had collapsed inward, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. The porch sagged at a drunken angle, its floorboards rotted through. Most of the windows weren't just broken, they were gone. The empty spaces boarded up with mismatched, weathered planks like blind eyes. The wood of the walls was grey and splintered, covered in a creeping moss that glowed a sickly green in the dim light. A wave of nausea, so powerful it made her sway, washed over her. This wasn't a shelter. This wasn't a home. This was a grave. The last, flickering ember of her hope was extinguished, plunged into an icy, black despair. Her legs felt weak, and she leaned against a tree for support, the rough bark digging into her back. As they drew closer, a smell hit them, so thick and foul it was almost a physical barrier. It was the smell of a place long dead, of things left to rot in the damp and the dark, an overwhelming miasma of mold, wet decay, and the acrid stench of animal nests. It clung to the air, coating her tongue and burning the inside of her nose. Luke gagged, pulling the collar of his shirt over his face. Helen felt her stomach clench violently. This was the smell of utter hopelessness. It was worse than the stale poverty of their old apartment. It was the smell of nature actively reclaiming a man-made failure, swallowing it whole. She could almost taste the rot, a flavor of sour earth and forgotten things. The physical revulsion was so strong, it momentarily overshadowed her emotional devastation. This place wasn't just abandoned. It felt diseased, contagious, and the very air seemed to warn them away. A silent, putrid scream of "get out!" But there was nowhere else to go. This was the end of the line, and it stank of death. The front door hung precariously on one rusted hinge. It wasn't even closed. Helen gave it a tentative push. It didn't swing open. It scraped and groaned across the warped floor, a sound like a tortured animal. The darkness inside was absolute, a solid wall of black that the weak afternoon light could not penetrate. A draught of cold, stagnant air washed over them, carrying the scent of rot and something else, the dry, dusty smell of time itself. She could hear the faint, frantic scuttling of unseen things in the walls and corners, the tiny claws of rats or mice on bare wood. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her skin, raising goosebumps on her arms. She took a hesitant step across the threshold, her foot landing on something soft and pulpy. She recoiled, a choked cry escaping her lips. This was a trap. The hope had been a lure, a cruel joke played by a merciless fate, designed to lead her from a familiar hell into a new, unknown, and infinitely more terrifying one. Her body began to tremble, an uncontrollable shudder that started deep in her bones. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, and the shapes of the room began to emerge from the darkness. It was worse than she could have imagined. The collapsed section of the roof had allowed years of rain and snow to pour in, turning one entire corner of the single room into a mush of rotted wood, black mold, and sodden debris. A rusty wood-burning stove stood in the center, its pipe disconnected and hanging crookedly. A few pieces of broken furniture, a three-legged chair, an overturned table, lay scattered like the bones of some long-dead creature. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust and grime, laced with cobwebs so old they looked like shrouds. There was no electricity, no light switch, no outlets. She saw a primitive hand pump over a stone sink in the corner, but a quick, hopeful try produced only a dry, rasping gasp from the pipes. No running water. The silence in the cabin was different from the silence outside. It was a heavy, listening silence, the silence of a tomb. She felt watched, judged by the decay that surrounded her. Luke, who had been clinging to her coat, finally let go. He walked slowly into the center of the room, his small frame silhouetted against the dim light from the doorway. He turned, his face pale and smudged with dirt, his eyes huge and dark. He looked around at the ruin, at the collapsed ceiling, at the dirt and the darkness. Then he looked back at his mother. His voice was small, stripped of all emotion, a flat, dead thing. "Is this it, Mum?" he asked. "Is this our new house?" The simple, honest question shattered the last of Helen's composure. It was an indictment, a final judgment on her failure. She had promised him an adventure, a home, a safe place, and she had led him here to this forgotten, rotting shack in the middle of a hostile wilderness. A sob, hot and violent, ripped its way up from her chest, a raw sound of pure agony. She couldn't answer. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at her son, the evidence of her catastrophic mistake, and feel the full, crushing weight of what she had done. She sank to her knees on the filthy floor, the splintered wood digging into her legs. The movement was not a choice. Her body simply gave out. Sophie, startled by her mother's sudden collapse and the raw sound of her grief, began to wail, her cries echoing in the dead space of the cabin. The sound blended with Helen's own broken sobs, creating a duet of misery. This was it. The bottom. She had thought she was at the bottom before, in the city, counting her last few dollars. She had been wrong. That was a ledge. This was the abyss. Here, there were no neighbors to hear them, no passing cars, no city lights to promise that the world was still turning. There was only the cold, the rot, the suffocating isolation, and the terrified cries of her children. She felt a profound, physical hollowness, as if her very soul had been scooped out, leaving nothing but a shell of a woman. The despair was no longer a feeling. It was the air she breathed, the floor she knelt on, the very substance of her reality. She was trapped, more completely and more terrifyingly than ever before. She had traded a quick, sharp crisis, the eviction, for this, a slow, grinding and inescapable misery. In the city, there was at least the theoretical possibility of help, of a shelter, of another menial job. Here, there was nothing, no one. The solution the lawyer's letter had offered was a lie. It wasn't a roof over their heads. It was a tomb with a broken lid. It wasn't a fresh start. It was a slower, colder, more isolated way to starve. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeped into her bones. It was the chill of absolute surrender. Her body felt impossibly heavy, pinned to the floor by the gravity of her failure. She closed her eyes, but the image of the ruined cabin was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. She had dragged her children across the country to deliver them to a place worse than the one she'd fled. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She had nothing left, no money, no hope, no strength. There was only the darkness of the cabin and the echoing sound of her daughter's cries. The first few days were a blur of cold, gnawing hunger and the suffocating scent of mold, while Helen, her movements slow and mechanical as a sleepwalker's, tried to patch a persistent leak in the roof with a hopeless mixture of mud and leaves, a futile gesture against the mountain's endless dampness. Luke had grown restless. The grim reality of their new home had crushed his initial, frail excitement, replacing it with a profound, childlike boredom that was its own form of suffering. He paced the single, dark room, a tiny prisoner in their wooden cage. He poked at the black mold spreading across the wall, his finger coming away wet and disturbingly slimy. He kicked listlessly at a pile of rotted debris in the corner, a small cloud of dust motes dancing in a stray sunbeam. It was then that his foot landed with a loud, unnatural sound, not the sharp crack of breaking wood, but a deep, hollow thump that echoed in the cabin's oppressive silence. He froze, his head cocked to the side. He looked down. One of the wide, splintered floorboards near the cold, dead hearth sat just a fraction lower than its neighbors, its edges dark with shadow and secrets. He stomped on it again, a small, tentative action. Thump. The sound was definite, distinct from the solid floor around it. A spark of curiosity, the first real emotion he'd felt besides misery, lit up in his eyes. He knelt, the filthy wood cold against his knees, and ran his small, dirty fingers along the board's perimeter. The other boards were sealed tight with decades of grime and settled dust, but this one had a clear, defined gap around it. He picked at the edge, his fingernails scraping against the rough grain, searching for a purchase. His finger caught on a small, carved notch near the end, almost invisible in the dim light. It was smooth, deliberately made. His heart began to beat a little faster. He hooked his fingers into the notch and pulled. The board resisted, swollen with damp, but then it shifted with a low, groaning complaint. The sound of long-dormant wood being disturbed. A sliver of pure, undisturbed darkness appeared in the gap. He pulled harder, his small body straining with the effort, his breath coming in short, excited gasps. This was a secret. With a final, protesting screech of wood against wood, the floorboard came loose. Luke scrambled back as it tilted, and he could finally lift it away, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity underneath. The air that rose from the opening was different from the cabin's pervasive rot. It was a dry, dusty smell, the scent of a space that had been sealed for a very long time, like opening a forgotten book. Luke peered into the hole. It wasn't deep, just a small, hollow space in the earth beneath the floor, and nestled in the center of the packed dirt, there was something. It wasn't treasure, not what a 10-year-old would imagine. It was a small, lumpy bundle, wrapped in what looked like a faded and frayed blue and white checkered dishcloth, tied shut with a piece of twine. It was the only thing in the small, dark space. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Mom, you have to see this." The word, spoken with such urgency, was a stone thrown into the stagnant pool of Helen's despair. Helen didn't move at first. Every muscle in her body ached with a weariness that felt ancient. Her mind was a fog of failure. Luke's voice barely registered, another small sound in a world of misery. "Mom," he said again, louder this time, his voice sharp with impatience. "Come here, I found something." The tone finally pierced her apathy. She turned her head slowly, her neck stiff. She saw him kneeling on the floor, his face illuminated by a sliver of light from the door, his eyes wide and fixed on a dark hole in the floor beside him. A cold spike of alarm shot through her. A snake. Rats. She scrambled to her feet, her maternal instinct overriding her exhaustion for the first time in days. "Luke, get away from there," she commanded, her voice raspy. But he didn't move. He just pointed a trembling finger into the hole. "It's okay," he said. "Look." Cautiously, Helen approached, her heart hammering against her ribs with a new kind of fear. She knelt beside her son, her own knees protesting, and peered into the darkness beneath the floor. Her eyes adjusted, and she saw what he was pointing at, the small, cloth-wrapped parcel. Her fear subsided, replaced by a wave of intense curiosity. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached into the cold, earthy space. The cloth was rough and stiff with age, the twine brittle beneath her fingers. It was surprisingly light. She lifted it out and placed it on the floor between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stared at the humble package, a relic from an unknown past. The silence in the cabin was profound, a listening stillness, as if the decrepit walls were holding their breath. With fumbling fingers, Helen worked at the tight knot of the twine. It crumbled into dust under the pressure. She carefully unfolded the corners of the dishcloth. The fabric was so old it felt like paper, and it threatened to disintegrate in her hands. Inside, nestled on the faded blue checks, lay two objects that made no sense at all. One was a small, hardcover book, its leather cover cracked and warped. The other was a single, small, and intricately shaped brass key, its surface pitted and dark with a rusty patina. She picked up the key first. It was cold and heavy in her palm, its weight feeling substantial, real. In a world that had become flimsy and nightmarish, the head of the key was shaped like a stylized bird, maybe a raven or a crow, its details worn smooth by time and handling. It was a key to something small, a lockbox or a cabinet perhaps. It was a question with no answer. Then she reached for the book. It was a diary. The cover was unmarked, a blank slate of dark, cracked leather. Her heart gave a strange, painful lurch. A diary was a container of secrets, a vessel of a life lived. Whose life? She felt a tremor of something akin to fear, a sense of trespassing on sacred ground. She could almost feel the presence of the person who had written in this book, a ghost in the room with them. Luke watched her, his eyes wide and unblinking, all his earlier boredom forgotten, replaced by a rapt fascination. He had unearthed a story, and now they were both caught in its first, mysterious chapter. This was the first thing in this God-forsaken place that wasn't about decay. It was about something hidden. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and mold, Helen opened the diary. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with a tight, slanted script written in faded blue ink. The first page was dated May 12, 1982. A name was written below the date, Zelda May Forrester, her great-aunt, a name that, until a week ago, had been nothing more than a ghost story from her own mother's past. Now here was her voice, silent on the page. Helen's fingers trembled as she traced the name. It felt like making contact with a spirit. She started to read, the words of a stranger who was also her blood. The early entries were mundane, descriptions of the weather, of cooking for the men at the mining camp, her loneliness in the stark, male-dominated world. But her tone was not one of complaint. It was one of quiet observation, of a woman who saw everything. She wrote of the hardness of the men's hands, the coal dust that was never fully washed from their skin, and the hope in their eyes when they spoke of the cooperative they were building, of owning their own fortune. Helen's stomach clenched, not from hunger, but from a growing sense of dread and fascination. She skimmed through the pages, the story pulling her in. Erasing the cold and the misery of the cabin around her, Zelda's entries became more focused, more intense. She wrote of one man in particular, a man named Thomas, the leader of the cooperative. She didn't write his name with the same detachment she used for the others. She wrote of the sound of his laugh, the way he looked at the mountains as if he owned them already, the gentle way he treated her. Helen felt a flush of heat in her own cheeks, an intimate connection to this long-dead woman's secret love. But then the tone shifted. A new name appeared in the diary, written with a darker, heavier stroke of the pen. Thorne, Jedediah Thorne, the boss from the big company who wanted the cooperative's land. Zelda wrote of his cold eyes, his smile that never reached them, and the fear he inspired. She described him as a patient wolf, circling the sheep, waiting for the right moment to strike. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. Fear bled through the ink. Thorne was here again. His offer is an insult, a threat. Another entry read, "Thomas told me not to worry. He said the law is on their side, but Thorne's law is not written in books." And then a final chilling entry dated October 1984. The handwriting was shaky, blotched in places as if by tears or rain. It was just one sentence, repeated 3 times, a frantic mantra of grief and terror. They're all gone. He took them all. After that, the pages were blank. Helen's blood ran cold. She slammed the diary shut, a cloud of ancient dust puffing into the air. A story of love and hope had turned into a nightmare, a massacre. The silence in the cabin felt heavy, charged with the ghosts of Zelda's words. But one phrase, from an earlier, more hopeful entry, stuck in her mind, a hook she couldn't shake loose. Zelda had written about hiding a gift for Thomas, something to celebrate their future, keeping it safe in a shelter from the greed of man. A shelter. The words echoed in Helen's head. The phrase became an obsession. A shelter from the greed of man. It wasn't in the cabin. The diary and key had been hidden here, but the shelter itself had to be somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere Thorne wouldn't look. The diary was a map, she realized, and she had only found the first landmark. Helen stood up, her body buzzing with a nervous energy that banished all her earlier lethargy. Despair had been replaced by purpose, a desperate need to uncover the rest of this story, to understand the tragedy that soaked the very ground she stood on. "Stay here, Luke," she said, her voice firm. "Don't move from this spot." She grabbed the small brass key, its bird-shaped head now seeming like a dark omen, and strode to the door. The world outside the cabin was no longer just a hostile wilderness. It was a crime scene, a landscape of secrets. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows through the trees, turning the woods into a labyrinth of black and gold. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and a strange, exhilarating resolve. She was no longer a victim of this place. She was an investigator. Her eyes scanned the overgrown clearing, searching for anything that didn't belong, anything man-made that could be considered a shelter. An old shed had collapsed into a pile of rotting lumber. The rusted hulk of a pickup truck, half swallowed by weeds, sat near the edge of the woods. Nothing seemed right. The phrase, "greed of man," suggested something hidden from sight, something underground, perhaps. Her gaze fell upon a dense, tangled thicket of thorny bushes near the back of the clearing, a place so overgrown and unwelcoming that no one would willingly go near it. It was a wall of spiky, grasping branches, a natural fence. It seemed designed to keep people out. Driven by an intuition she couldn't explain, Helen began to walk towards it. The thorns snagged at her thin jacket, tearing the fabric and scratching her skin, drawing small beads of blood. She ignored the pain, her focus absolute. She had to see what was behind it. She felt like she was being guided by Zelda's ghost, following a path laid out 40 years ago, parting the thorny branches with her hands, wincing as the sharp points dug into her flesh. She pushed her way into the heart of the thicket, and there she saw it. Almost completely obscured by dirt, moss and tangled roots, was a flat, circular object. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was a lid, a heavy, round cast-iron lid, about 3 feet in diameter, with a large, rusted ring pull in the center. It was the cover to an old well or a cistern, And on the front, next to a heavy-duty hasp, was a massive, rust-encrusted padlock, a shelter, hidden from sight, protected by nature itself. Helen's breath hitched. She scrambled back out of the thorns, her hands bleeding and her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She ran back to the cabin, her mind racing. The key. It had to be. She snatched it from the floor where she'd left it and ran back, Luke calling after her in confusion. She knelt before the cistern lid, the damp earth seeping through the knees of her jeans. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the small brass key steady. With trembling fingers, she inserted the key into the padlock. It resisted at first, the keyhole clogged with dirt and rust. She wiggled it, pushed it, her desperation growing with every failed attempt. She felt a surge of panic. What if it was the wrong key? What if this was all a dead end? She took a deep breath, forcing her hands to steady, and tried one last time, pushing and turning with focused pressure. There was a grating sound, a horrible screech of metal on metal, and then a loud, definitive click that echoed in the quiet woods. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. The padlock sprang open. A wave of dizziness washed over Helen. It was real, this was it. She worked the heavy lock off the hasp and gripped the cold, iron ring pull with both hands. She pulled, her muscles straining. It didn't budge. It felt as though it were fused to the earth. She planted her feet, leaned back and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed, a low groan escaping her throat. It wasn't just her own strength, it was the force of her desperation, of her children's future, of her need for an answer. With a deep, groaning scrape of metal against stone, the lid shifted. It moved only an inch, but it was enough. She readjusted her grip and pulled again, using her body weight to drag the immensely heavy iron circle sideways. It grated across the stone lip of the opening, the sound setting her teeth on edge. Inch by inch, she uncovered a perfect circle of absolute blackness. A blast of cold, subterranean air washed over her face, carrying a smell that was entirely different from the rest of this rotting place. It was a clean, mineral smell, the smell of cold stone, dry earth, and deep, undisturbed darkness. There was no scent of decay, no dampness. This space had been dry. It had been safe. She knelt at the edge, peering down, but the darkness was total, impenetrable. She could see nothing. She called out, "Hello!" Her voice was swallowed by the void, not even an echo returning. The silence that answered was profound, ancient. Whatever was down there had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time, untouched and unseen. She needed a light. The sun was almost gone, and the woods were sinking into a deep purple twilight that blurred the edges of the world. She ran back to the cabin, her mind a whirlwind. She rummaged frantically through their meager belongings, her hands shaking. In one of the cardboard boxes, she found what she was looking for, a small book of matches and a single, half-used emergency candle she had packed on a whim. It felt like a providential gift. She returned to the cistern, her heart a frantic drum. She lit the candle, its small, flickering flame casting a weak, dancing circle of light. It seemed impossibly fragile against the immense darkness of the hole. Tying the candle to a length of the twine that had bound the diary, she slowly, carefully, lowered it into the opening. The flame wavered, threatened to go out, then stabilized as it descended into the still air below. The darkness grudgingly gave way, revealing the secrets it had held for 40 years. The cistern wasn't as deep as she had feared. The candlelight revealed stone walls, perfectly dry, descending about 15 feet. At the bottom, there wasn't water, but a sturdy-looking wooden platform built just above the cistern floor. And resting in the center of that platform, looking pristine and untouched by time, was a dark green, military-style footlocker. The sight of it made the air leave her lungs in a silent whoosh. It was there, the shelter, the final destination on Zelda's map. But getting to it was another problem. She looked around frantically, her eyes landing on the rotted remains of an old fence near the edge of the woods. The posts were rotted, but the wire was still intact. Working quickly, her hands raw and bleeding, she tore a long section of fence wire free, testing its strength. It seemed strong enough. She fashioned loops for her hands and feet, creating a makeshift rope ladder. It was a terrifying, reckless idea, but the thought of what was in that footlocker gave her a courage she didn't know she possessed. Lowering herself into the cistern was an act of pure faith. The wire cut into her hands, and her feet kept slipping. The darkness below seemed to be trying to pull her down. She didn't look, just focused on her grip, on the rhythm of her descent. Her breath held tight in her chest. Her feet finally touched the wooden platform with a solid thud. She was down. She was inside. The air was cool and still, the silence absolute except for the sound of her own ragged breathing. The candlelight cast huge, dancing shadows on the curved stone walls, making the small space feel like a cathedral or a tomb. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, her heart pounding in her ears. The footlocker sat before her, squat and solid. It had two simple latches on the front, but no lock. It was as if Zelda knew that once the cistern was found, no further lock was necessary. With a hand that shook so much she could barely control it, Helen reached out and flipped open the two metal latches. They sprang open with a loud, metallic snap that echoed in the enclosed space. She took another shaky breath and lifted the heavy lid. The smell that wafted out was the ancient, delicate scent of old paper and dried flowers. On top of the contents lay a bundle of letters, tied with a simple faded blue ribbon. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She gently lifted the bundle out. She could see the same faded blue ink as the diary, the same slanted script. These were Zelda's. But they weren't a journal. They were letters, addressed to Thomas, the man from the miners, cooperative, love letters, letters full of hope and plans for a future that, as Helen knew from the diary, would never come to be. A profound sadness washed over her, a deep, aching empathy for this woman she had never met. This footlocker wasn't just a hiding place, it was a shrine, a memorial to a love that had been violently extinguished. She carefully set the letters aside on the platform, a sacred artifact she would not yet disturb. It was what lay beneath them that demanded her attention now. Her eyes fell upon the contents of the chest, and for a moment, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. The footlocker was filled almost to the brim with them, small rectangular bars of a dull, heavy-looking metal stacked in neat, tight rows. They didn't shine like pirate treasure. They had a dense, soft gleam in the candlelight, a muted buttery yellow, gold. Her mind reeled. It couldn't be. It was impossible. She reached in, her fingers hesitating just above the surface, as if she were afraid they would burn her. She touched one. It was cool, smooth and impossibly heavy for its size. She wrapped her fingers around it and lifted it out. The weight of it was shocking, a dense, physical reality that contradicted its small size. It was heavier than any rock, any piece of metal she had ever held. It felt like holding the weight of the earth itself in her palm. Her knees felt weak, and she had to brace herself against the side of the chest to keep from falling. This was a fortune, an impossible, life-altering fortune. She held the bar closer to the candlelight, turning it over and over. It wasn't a raw nugget. It had been smelted, poured, and stamped. On its surface was a small, embossed insignia, two crossed pickaxes over the letters AMC, Appalachian Miners Cooperative. The words from the diary slammed back into her mind. The cooperative, the men who had been building their own fortune, the men who had disappeared. This was it. This was their gold. This was the fortune that Thomas and the other miners had dug out of the mountain with their own hands. It was the treasure that had cost them their lives. A wave of nausea and vertigo swept over her. This wasn't just a discovery of wealth. It was a discovery of a crime. This gold was evidence. It was blood money. Zelda hadn't just hidden it for safekeeping. She had stolen it. She had stolen it back from the man who had murdered for it, the man named Thorne. And now, 40 years later, the secret was in Helen's hands. The weight of the gold bar was suddenly the weight of a terrible and dangerous truth. The full weight of the discovery crashed down on her, a physical and psychological blow. She was sitting in a dry cistern in the middle of a hostile wilderness, on top of a fortune in stolen gold that was evidence of a 40-year-old massacre. The sheer insanity of it was overwhelming. Her initial shock gave way to a new, sharper emotion. Fear. A deep, cold, and rational fear. The diary had spoken of Jedediah Thorne, a powerful man who had made a group of miners disappear to get what he wanted. A man who had lived with this secret for decades. What would a man like that do if he found out that someone, A broke single mother with 2 children had stumbled upon his crime. The question answered itself. The isolation of the cabin, once a symbol of her misery, now felt like a death trap. The silence of the woods was no longer empty. It felt like it was listening, waiting. She was no longer just poor and desperate. She was now the keeper of a secret that could get her and her children killed. The gold was not a solution. It was a fuse, and she had just lit it. She frantically began to put everything back. Her movements were clumsy, panicked. She placed the gold bar back in the chest, its thud against the others sounding unnervingly loud in the silence. She laid the packet of love letters gently on top of the gold, a fragile layer of love over a foundation of violence. She closed the lid of the footlocker, the sound echoing ominously. She didn't bother relatching it. She scrambled up the makeshift wire ladder, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands raw and bleeding. She didn't feel the pain. All she felt was a primal urge to get out, to get back into the open air, to escape the tomb of secrets she had uncovered. Hauling herself over the stone lip of the cistern, she collapsed onto the damp earth, gasping for breath, her body trembling uncontrollably. The small flickering candle at the bottom of the cistern cast a single accusatory eye of light up at her from the darkness. She had to hide it. She had to pretend none of this had ever happened. With frantic energy, she grabbed the heavy iron lid and began to drag it back into place. The grating sound of the metal on stone was a shriek in the deepening twilight. It took all of her remaining strength to pull it completely over the opening, plunging the cistern back into absolute darkness. She stood, panting, looking at the disturbed ground around the thicket. It was too obvious. Someone would see that it had been uncovered. She began to grab fallen branches, leaves, and clumps of thorny vines, frantically trying to camouflage the lid, to make it look as untouched as it had been just an hour before. She worked until her fingers were numb and her back was screaming, her mind a frantic loop of terror. Thorn, the name was a drumbeat of doom in her head. He was out there, somewhere. What if he was still looking for this? What if he had been watching this land, this cabin, for years, waiting? The thought sent a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline through her veins. She was a trespasser on a battlefield, and she had just picked up the enemy's flag. She stumbled back towards the cabin, the diary clutched in her hand like a talisman. The brass key felt heavy and dangerous in her pocket. They were no longer objects of mystery. They were liabilities, evidence. The cabin, which had seemed like a ruin just that morning, now looked different. It looked like a trap. The faint light from the doorway was not a welcoming beacon, but a vulnerable opening. Luke was waiting for her just inside the door, his face a mask of worry. "Mum, what happened? You were gone so long, your hands are bleeding." He rushed towards her, but she put a hand out to stop him. She couldn't tell him. How could she explain this nightmare to a 10-year-old? How could she put this terrifying burden on his small shoulders? "I'm okay, sweetie," she lied, her voice a strained whisper she barely recognized as her own. I just fell." She had to protect him. She had to protect Sophie. And to do that, she had to carry the weight of this terrible, golden secret alone. As darkness finally swallowed the mountains completely, Helen sat on the filthy floor of the cabin, Luke asleep beside her, and Sophie whimpering softly in a makeshift bed. She didn't light a candle. She sat in the absolute blackness, the diary resting in her lap. The despair she had felt upon arrival was gone, burned away and replaced by something far more potent, a paralyzing, razor-sharp terror. She wasn't just fighting poverty anymore. She was in a story that didn't belong to her, a ghost story of greed and murder. The gold in the cistern wasn't a miracle. It was a curse. It was a sleeping dragon, and she had just prodded it awake. Every creak of the old cabin, every rustle of leaves outside made her flinch. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner in her chest. She was alone, with 2 children, miles from any help, in a place steeped in violence, holding a secret that a powerful killer would do anything to keep buried. The hope of the inheritance had led her not to a home, but to the heart of a 40-year-old crime, and she had a horrifying feeling that the killer was much closer than she thought. The only light in the oppressive darkness was the single flickering flame of the candle she'd found. It cast long, dancing shadows that made the broken cabin seem to breathe around her. Sleep was an impossibility. Her body was a taut wire of fear, every nerve ending alive and screaming. The diary lay open in her lap, its brittle pages feeling like sheets of dried skin. She forced herself to read, to understand the ghost whose legacy had become her terrifying burden. Zelda's neat, slanted script filled the pages, chronicling a life of quiet hardship that slowly, page by page, spiraled into a vortex of fear. Helen's finger traced the name Thorn, written over and over, the ink seeming to grow darker with each mention. She could feel Zelda's dread seeping out of the paper, a cold miasma that settled deep in her own bones. This wasn't a story anymore. It was a warning, a desperate message sent across 4 decades, and it had been delivered directly, terrifyingly to her. The candle flames sputtered, and she felt a primal urge to look over her shoulder into the absolute blackness of the corners. The diary painted the portrait of a monster, not with horns and claws, but with a cold smile and a checkbook. Jedediah Thorn. Zelda described him as a man who moved with the silent confidence of a predator, his voice a low, placating rumble that could turn to ice in an instant. He talks of progress. One entry from 1983 read, "But his eyes only see what is his for the taking. He is a patient wolf, circling the flock." Helen felt a shiver trace its way down her spine. The words were so vivid, she could almost see the man, feel the chill of his presence. She looked at the boarded-up windows and felt a profound, suffocating claustrophobia. The cabin was no longer a simple ruin. It was a hiding place, a bunker, and she now understood the paranoia that must have driven Zelda to seal herself away from the world. Zelda hadn't been a recluse by choice. She had been a prisoner of what she knew, trapped in this tiny wooden box by the long shadow of Jedediah Thorn. And now, Helen had inherited not just the prison, but the secret that came with it. She carefully untied the faded blue ribbon from the bundle of letters. They were written by Thomas, the leader of the miners' cooperative, the man Zelda had loved. His handwriting was strong and clear, full of a hope so bright it was painful to read. He wrote not of gold, but of futures. He described the schoolhouse they would build, the small clinic they would fund. One passage made Helen stop breathing. "This first batch of gold isn't just for us, my love," Thomas had written. "It's for our children and their children. It's the foundation of something that will last, something they can't take from us." A hot tear splashed onto the 40-year-old paper, smudging the hopeful words. She looked over at her own children, Luke sleeping fitfully and Sophie, a small warm lump in the darkness. The connection was a physical blow, a bridge of shared parental love spanning the decades. This wasn't about a treasure anymore. It was about stolen dreams, stolen futures. It was about children left with nothing, a legacy of violence instead of hope. The diary's final entries were almost illegible, the handwriting a frantic scrawl. The story of the massacre wasn't told in a narrative, but in fragmented bursts of horror, recorded by a witness on the edge of madness. The sound at night, like thunder, but not thunder. He told them it was a meeting, a negotiation. "I saw the trucks leave the valley road, empty. He took them all. God forgive me, he took them all." Helen's stomach revolted. She scrambled to the open doorway and retched into the bushes, her body convulsing with violent, dry heaves. The acidic taste in her mouth was the taste of pure horror. The ghosts of this place were no longer just a feeling. They had names. They had a story. She was standing on a mass grave. The gold in the cistern below was not a fortune. It was the corpus delicti, the body of the crime itself. She felt tainted, contaminated by the knowledge. It was a poison in her blood, a secret so dark it threatened to consume her. She had stumbled out of her own small tragedy and into an epic of pure evil. After the terror came a sliver of chilling clarity. A later entry, written months after the massacre in a steadier hand, explained everything. Zelda had witnessed the crime from a distance, hidden, and in the chaotic aftermath, when Thorn and his men were securing the land and silencing the local authorities, she had acted, driven by a grief so profound it had burned away her fear. She had found where Thorn had temporarily stashed the miner's gold before he could move it. She described stealing it in the dead of night, not for wealth, but as an act of penance and vengeance. "He will not build his empire on their bones," Zelda wrote. "This gold will not be his reward. It will be a stone chained to his neck for eternity. It will be the proof. It will be justice, even if I am the only one who knows it." Helen finally understood. The hidden footlocker wasn't a treasure chest. It was a time capsule, It was a bomb, designed by a grieving woman, set to go off decades later, and she, Helen, was the one holding the detonator. The next morning arrived, but the sun brought no warmth, no comfort. The world felt leached of color, rendered in shades of gray by the sleepless, terrifying night. Helen had hidden the diary and the key beneath a loose stone in the hearth, the act feeling like burying a body. She had to pretend to be normal for Luke. She forced a smile, her facial muscles feeling stiff and foreign. "Let's see if we can find some berries," she said, her voice a hollow imitation of cheerfulness. She needed them to be outside, away from the listening walls of the cabin, but as they stepped out into the clearing, a sound began to build in the distance. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was a low, powerful rumble, a sound of expensive, brute force machinery that was utterly alien to the quiet woods. It grew louder, vibrating not just in the air but up through the soles of her worn shoes, a deep, guttural growl that made the birds fall silent. Her heart instantly seized in her chest. An icy dread washed over her. This was not a lost hunter or a park ranger. She knew, with a certainty that was absolute and terrifying, who was coming. It broke through the tree line like a predator emerging from cover. A massive, gleaming black truck, so new and clean, it looked like it had been teleported from a city showroom directly into her nightmare. The chrome grille flashed in the morning sun like a row of bared teeth. It rolled confidently into the clearing, its oversized tires crushing weeds and saplings with casual indifference, and came to a stop just yards from the dilapidated porch. The sheer contrast was obscene. The vehicle, a monument to wealth and power, parked before the cabin, a monument to decay and despair. Helen felt frozen in place, a rabbit caught in the glare of headlights. Her first instinct was to run, to grab her children and flee into the woods. But where would they go? Her second instinct, fierce and primal, took over. She shoved Luke behind her, shielding him with her body, her hand trembling as she held his shoulder. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, so loud she was sure the whole world could hear it. The driver's side door opened with a quiet, expensive-sounding click. A man swung himself out with an easy, athletic grace. He was tall, dressed in a waxed canvas jacket that probably cost more than her entire life savings, and clean sturdy leather boots. His hair was silver at the temples, and his face was rugged, but his eyes, even from this distance, were a startlingly pale, cold blue. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his gaze sweeping over the ruined cabin, then her, then Luke cowering behind her. He was taking inventory, assessing, categorizing. Helen felt stripped bare under his gaze, her poverty, her fear, her vulnerability, all laid out for his inspection. This was him, Jedediah Thorne. The name from the diary now had a face, and it was a face of calm, absolute control. He was the wolf Zelda had described, and he had just walked into her fold. The air grew thin and she struggled to draw a breath, her lungs feeling tight and useless. He walked toward them, his steps silent on the soft earth. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell the faint, clean scent of expensive soap and leather. "Morning," he said. His voice was exactly as Zelda had described it, a deep, smooth baritone, utterly devoid of a mountain accent. It was the voice of boardrooms and backroom deals. "I'm Jedediah Thorne. My property borders this one." The name, spoken by the man himself, landed like a punch to her stomach. Helen felt a wave of dizziness, so intense she had to lock her knees to keep from collapsing. "He's here," the thought screamed through her mind. "He's real. He's here." She could only manage a tight, jerky nod, her throat closing up, strangling any words she might have formed. He knew her name was not on any recent deed. He knew exactly who had inherited this land. His presence here was not a coincidence. It was a summons. He was looking directly at her, his cold eyes searching her face, and she knew, she just knew, that he was looking for a flicker of recognition, a sign that she knew who he really was. Thorne's gaze drifted to the cabin, and he made a soft tsk sound of feigned pity. "Looks like you drew the short straw," he said, his tone dripping with a condescension that made Helen's skin crawl. Old Zelda let this place go to hell years ago. She was a strange one, that's for sure. The casual disrespect for the dead, for the woman whose story she now carried, sent a jolt of anger through Helen's fear. He was probing, testing her reaction, seeing if the name meant anything to her. She forced her expression to remain blank, a mask of weary indifference, praying he couldn't see the frantic terror churning inside her. She felt like an actor in a play she hadn't rehearsed, opposite a man who had written the script. Luke peeked out from behind her, and Thorne's eyes flicked down to him for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable in their cold depths, before he looked back at Helen. The silent, implicit threat of that glance was as clear as a spoken word. "Look," he said, shifting his tone to one of magnanimous generosity. "I'll be frank. This land is worthless. The cabin's a teardown, the well is dry, and the soil's no good for anything. But I've been consolidating the surrounding parcels for a private nature preserve. The lie was so polished, so plausible. I can give you $5,000 for it, cash, more than it's worth, but it'll get you and your kids a bus ticket out of here and a fresh start somewhere else. $5,000. The number was a calculated insult. It was just enough to tempt someone at the absolute end of their rope, but it was nothing. It was dust. Helen's mind flashed to the footlocker full of gold bars, a fortune that could change their lives forever, a fortune that belonged to the victims of this man. The chasm between his offer and the truth beneath her feet was so vast it made her feel sick. He was offering her a handful of pennies for a king's ransom, and he was doing it with a smile on his face. Helen found her voice, though it came out as a reedy whisper she barely recognized. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thorne. I just need some time to think about it." It was the only thing she could say, a desperate attempt to buy a few hours, a few days, to figure out what to do. A slow smile spread across Thorne's face, but it was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. It didn't reach his eyes, which remained as cold and hard as river stones. He knew she was stalling. He could smell her fear. He took a half-step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to look up at him. "Time is something you may not have a lot of," he said, his voice dropping low, losing its friendly veneer. "This isn't a place for amateurs." The shift was so sudden, so stark, it was like a mask had been dropped. The friendly landowner was gone, and the man from the diary was standing right in front of her, the monster made of flesh and blood. He gestured vaguely toward the dense, dark woods that surrounded them, the woods that had felt so menacing the night before. "It's a rough part of the country," he continued, his voice a confidential murmur now, a serpent's hiss. "Things happen, people get lost. There are elements out here you wouldn't want to run into." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting the threat take root in her mind. It's certainly no place to be for a woman all alone with 2 young children. He was painting a picture for her, a picture of her own vulnerability, of her complete and utter isolation. He was reminding her that there was no one to hear her scream. He wasn't just talking about the land anymore. He was talking about her life, about her children's lives. Every word was a carefully chosen weapon, designed to cripple her with fear. To make his insulting offer seem like a generous lifeline, Helen felt a cold sweat trickle down the back of her neck. He began to turn away, as if the conversation were over, a deal waiting only for her inevitable surrender. He took 2 steps toward his truck, then stopped and looked back over his shoulder. The smile was gone. His face was a blank mask of cold authority. "This cabin is a fire trap," he stated, the words flat and hard as stone. "Old, dry wood. Be a real shame if a stray spark caught it. Tragic, really." He held her gaze for a long moment, his pale blue eyes pinning her in place. Accidents happen in these isolated places all the time. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a promise, delivered with the chilling certainty of a man who had made and kept such promises before. It was the final move in his game of intimidation, a clear and brutal declaration: "Take my deal and disappear, or I will make you disappear." The monster from Zelda's past was not a ghost. He was here, and he was threatening to do to her what he had done to all the others. The massive truck engine roared to life, the sound tearing through the fragile quiet of the mountains. He reversed, turned and drove away, disappearing back into the trees as quickly as he had appeared. The deep rumble faded, leaving behind a silence that was 1,000 times more terrifying than before. It was a silence now filled with his words, with his promise of accidents. Helen's legs finally gave out, and she slid to the ground, pulling Luke into a desperate, trembling hug. She was trapped. She was sitting on top of the evidence of a mass murder, a fortune in gold that could save her family, but the murderer himself had just knocked on her door and threatened to burn her alive. If she went to the police, what would she say? That a powerful, respected businessman was a monster from a 40-year-old diary. He owned the local sheriff, Zelda had written. He would crush her, but if she did nothing, he would be back. What would you do in her place? Would you risk everything for justice, or would you take the threat seriously and run for your life? The silence Thorne left behind was a living entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from his unspoken promises of violence. Helen's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one a painful effort. Her mind, a chaotic storm of terror, latched onto a single desperate thought. She was not Zelda. She would not let herself become a ghost in these woods, a forgotten story buried under 40 years of fear and silence. This monster had threatened her children. The realization was a spark in the overwhelming darkness, a flicker of pure, unadulterated maternal rage that began to burn through the icy paralysis of her fear. He thought she was weak, a broken woman easily swept aside. He didn't know she had already been to the bottom of the abyss and had clawed her way back. He didn't know that for a mother, there is no such thing as surrender when her children are at risk. A new resolve, hard and sharp as a shard of glass, began to form in her chest. She had to find help, not the corrupt local law he owned, but someone else, someone who knew this mountain, someone who understood its secrets, and she had to do it now before his shadow fell over her cabin again. A forgotten fragment of a conversation floated back to her, a piece of driftwood in the churning sea of her panic. The lawyer, on that cold, impersonal phone call from another lifetime, he had mentioned something. It's rural, very rural. I believe there's an old-timer, a Silas, who lives a few miles down the creek road, but he keeps to himself. At the time, the words meant nothing. Now they were a lifeline, a name. Silas, a few miles. It was a desperate gamble, a shot in the absolute dark. This Silas could be a friend of Thorne's. He could be just another paranoid recluse who would turn her away. He could be dangerous himself. She felt the cold sweat on her skin as she weighed the options. Staying here meant waiting for Thorne's accident to happen. The image of the cabin engulfed in flames, of her children trapped inside flashed in her mind with such brutal clarity that it made her gasp. The risk of seeking help was terrifying, but the certainty of what would happen if she stayed was unbearable. She had no choice. She had to trust a stranger. She had to run towards the only other soul on this God-forsaken mountain. She rose to her feet, her movements stiff but purposeful. "Luke," she said, her voice low and urgent, trying to keep the tremor of fear out of it. "We're going for a walk, a long one. We need to visit a neighbor." Luke looked up at her, his young face pale and streaked with dirt, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored her own. He didn't ask questions. He had seen the black truck. He had seen the man with the cold eyes. He had felt the shift in the world's gravity, the sudden, terrifying instability of their existence. He simply nodded, his small hand finding hers and gripping it with a strength that belied his age. Helen ducked back into the cabin's oppressive gloom. Her hands shook as she retrieved the diary and the small brass key from their hiding place in the hearth. These were her only weapons, a dead woman's words and a piece of rusted metal. They felt flimsy and pathetic against the power of a man like Thorne, but they were the truth. They were all she had. She tucked them deep into the pocket of her thin jacket, their weight a constant, terrifying reminder of the secret she carried. Then, grabbing Sophie, she stepped back out into the cold, unforgiving daylight, not looking back at the cabin. The journey was a pilgrimage of fear. The creek road was barely a path, a winding trail that followed a shallow, gurgling stream deeper into the wilderness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the undergrowth, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Helen's system. She imagined Thorne's men watching from the dense woods, their eyes following her every move. She shifted Sophie on her hip, the baby's weight and anchor pulling her down, while her other hand held fast to Luke's. The sun, filtering through the thick canopy of leaves, created a disorienting pattern of light and shadow on the path ahead, making it impossible to see clearly. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves, a scent that now seemed inextricably linked to death and secrets. She felt a crushing sense of her own foolishness. She was walking through a hostile wilderness, with her 2 children, toward the home of a complete stranger, carrying evidence of a decades-old crime. It was madness, but the image of Thorne's cold smile was a spur, driving her forward, one painful, terrified step at a time. The sound of the creek was a constant, mocking murmur beside them. After what felt like an eternity, an hour of walking that stretched her nerves to the breaking point, the woods began to thin. Through the trees, she saw a curl of grey smoke rising into the sky. It was a sign of life, a human presence in the vast emptiness. A small, unkempt clearing appeared, and in its center stood a cabin. This one was different from Zelda's ruin. It was small and weathered, its wood silvered by decades of sun and snow, but it was whole. The roof was intact, the windows were glazed, and a sturdy-looking axe was sunk into a large chopping block near the front porch. This was a place that was lived in, a fortress against the wilderness, not a victim of it. A scruffy-looking hound, chained near the steps, lifted its head as they approached and let out a single, low growl, but didn't bark. It just watched them with intelligent, weary eyes. Helen's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, Silas's home. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, a wave of profound uncertainty washing over her. She was about to knock on a stranger's door and unload a nightmare. He could slam the door in her face, or worse. Her fear for her children overrode her hesitation. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and walked slowly across the clearing, her feet feeling heavy as lead. She stopped at the bottom of the 3 wooden steps leading to the porch, her mouth suddenly dry as dust. "Luke, you and Sophie wait here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She climbed the steps, each one groaning under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. The door was solid wood, scarred and weathered. There was no bell, no knocker. She stood before it for a long moment, her courage failing her. What was she going to say? How could she explain this insanity without sounding like a madwoman? She thought of Thorne's face, the promise of an accident, and raised her trembling hand. She knocked. 3 sharp, hesitant raps. The sound was swallowed by the immense quiet of the forest. For a long moment, nothing happened. The only sound was the frantic pounding of her own heart and the low, suspicious whine from the chained dog. She was about to turn away, to admit defeat, when she heard a bolt being drawn on the other side of the door. The door creaked open a few inches, and a single, piercing blue eye peered out at her from the darkness within. It was a wary eye, an eye that had spent a lifetime watching and judging. "Ain't looking for visitors," a voice rasped, rough as gravel. "State your business." The man was a silhouette against the dim light of the cabin's interior, but she could see he was old, his frame stooped, his face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles. This had to be Silas. Helen's words came out in a rush, a torrent of frantic, whispered sentences. "My name is Helen Miller. I inherited the Forrester place, Zelda Forrester's cabin. I have my children. A man came to see me. A man named Thorne. He threatened me. I didn't know where else to go." She stopped, breathless, her confession hanging in the cold air between them. The name Thorne seemed to have a physical effect on the old man. The eye in the crack of the door widened almost imperceptibly. He was silent for a long, agonizing moment, his gaze flicking from her face down to Luke and Sophie huddled at the bottom of the steps, then back to her. He was assessing her, weighing her words, her fear. "Zelda's kin," he finally murmured, the words more to himself than to her. He slowly unlatched the chain and pulled the door open. "Get inside. All of you, now." His tone was not welcoming, but it was urgent. It was the command of a man who understood danger. Helen practically fell into the cabin, pulling Luke in behind her. The interior was dark and smelled powerfully of wood smoke, coffee and old wool. It was a single room, meticulously organized but cluttered with the artifacts of a long, solitary life. Stacked books, neatly folded blankets, and tools hanging from pegs on the wall. Silas bolted the door behind them, the sound of the heavy iron shooting home echoing in the small space. He was shorter than she'd expected, and wiry, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but still possessing a latent strength. His face was weathered leather, his eyes a pale, faded blue that seemed to hold the long memory of the mountains. He gestured towards a rough-hewn wooden table. "Sit," he commanded, his voice still gruff, "and tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Don't leave a single thing out." Helen sat, her body trembling, and began to talk. The story poured out of her, a chaotic jumble of the eviction, the false hope of the inheritance, the horror of the ruined cabin, and the discovery under the floorboards. Her voice broke as she described the diary and the cistern full of gold. She pulled the small, cracked leather book from her pocket and slid it across the table towards him. "She wrote about him," Helen whispered, her voice raw. "She wrote about everything." Silas didn't touch the diary at first. He just stared at it, his wrinkled face a mask of stone, but his pale eyes were full of a deep, ancient pain. He looked at it as if it were a ghost. Then, with a hand that trembled slightly, he reached out and placed his palm flat on the leather cover. He closed his eyes. It was a gesture of profound reverence, of communion with the past. He was not just seeing a book, he was seeing a life, a tragedy he knew all too well. When he opened his eyes again, they were swimming with an unshed grief that stunned Helen into silence. He knew the whole story. He had been there. "I helped Thomas build that platform in the cistern," Silas said, his voice a low, rough whisper that seemed to come from a great distance. "We built it to store food and supplies, a safe place for the cooperative, a shelter. That's what we called it." The confirmation sent a chill down Helen's spine. The diary was real. The story was real. "Zelda," he began, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat and looked away, toward the single window that faced the dark woods. Zelda was a good woman, quiet, saw everything. She loved Thomas, and he loved her. They were going to build a life here. They were going to use that gold to build a town, not a mansion. He fell silent, lost in a memory from 40 years ago, the air in the small cabin growing thick with the ghosts of his words. He was no longer just an old recluse. He was a keeper of history, the last living witness to a dream that had been turned into a nightmare by Jedediah Thorne. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, forming a picture more horrible than Helen could have imagined. This man's pain was the missing emotional core of Zelda's frantic, terrified scrawls. Silas finally looked back at her, his eyes hard and clear. "I was a part of the Appalachian Miners Cooperative," he stated, the words carrying the weight of a formal declaration. "There were 12 of us. We pooled our resources, bought the claim legally, and we struck a rich vein. That gold, that was ours. It was our future, our children's future." He spat the last words out with a venom that had not cooled in 40 years. Thorne wanted the land. He was with a big out-of-state corporation then, buying up everything. He made us an offer. It was an insult. We refused. We had the law on our side, or so we thought. He gave a short, bitter, mirthless laugh that was more like a sob. "We were fools. We were miners, not politicians. We didn't understand that men like Thorne don't follow the law. They buy it. They twist it, and when that doesn't work..." He paused, his gaze becoming distant and haunted. "They make their own." He was there, back in that valley, on that terrible night. Helen could see the massacre reflected in his old, tired eyes. "I'm the only one left," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The words hung in the smoky air of the cabin, a devastatingly simple epitaph for 11 men. "I was supposed to be at the meeting that night, the final negotiation Thorne called for, but my boy, he was only 5 then. He came down with a fever. A bad one. I stayed home to care for him. It saved my life." He stared down at his gnarled hands on the table, flexing them as if they still felt the phantom weight of a pickaxe. "I heard the noise that night, from miles away, like distant thunder, just as Zelda wrote, but it wasn't thunder. It was the dynamite Thorne's men used to seal the mine entrance, with my friends inside." A single tear traced a path down his wrinkled cheek. Helen felt her own throat tighten, a knot of shared grief and horror. The abstract crime from the diary was now viscerally real, described by a man who had lost everything. He hadn't just lost friends. He had lost a future, a brotherhood, a life he was supposed to lead. His survival was not a victory. It was a lifelong curse, a burden of memory he had carried alone for decades. "After," Silas continued, his voice regaining its hard edge, "Thorne's men came for me, but I knew they would. I took my wife and my boy and we disappeared into these mountains. We lived like animals for a year. When we finally came back, the cooperative was gone. The land belonged to Thorne's company. The official story was a mining accident, A cave-in. Tragic. Case closed. The sheriff he owned filed the report himself. The casual, brutal efficiency of the crime was breathtaking. It was a perfect, clean erasure of 11 lives. My wife, she couldn't take it. The fear. The ghosts. She left a few years later. Took our son with her, couldn't blame her. He looked around the small, lonely cabin, and Helen suddenly understood its true nature. It wasn't just a home, it was a bunker. A foxhole in a war that had never ended for him. He had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years, a ghost haunting the edges of Thorne's stolen kingdom, waiting. He was waiting for a sign, for a chance at a justice he had long given up on. And she, Helen, had just walked through his door and delivered it. He leaned forward, his pale eyes boring into hers, and delivered the final, devastating piece of the story. Zelda's diary tells you he ordered it, but there's something she didn't see. Something only I know. He took a shaky breath. Thorne was there that night. He wasn't just giving orders from his fine office. I was on the ridge that evening, checking my traps before I went home to my boy. I saw them. I saw Thorne talking to Thomas face to face, just before it all happened. Silas's voice dropped to a choked whisper, thick with a 40-year-old horror. They argued. Thomas wouldn't back down, and I saw it. I saw Thorne pull a pistol. He didn't have his men do it. He shot Thomas himself in cold blood. He murdered him right there, his hands covered in the same dirt as ours. The revelation struck Helen with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just greed. It was personal. It was the ultimate act of domination by a man who could not stand to be told no. This was the detail that changed everything. It made the crime provable, personal, and undeniable. It was the motive for Zelda's theft. It was the key to Thorne's destruction. A grim understanding passed between them, a silent pact forged in the smoky air of the cabin. They were no longer two strangers. They were allies, bound by a shared enemy and a shared secret. "He knows you're here," Silas said, his voice flat and certain. "He's been watching this property since Zelda died, waiting to see who would claim it. He's patient, but his patience has a limit. His visit wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum." The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. Helen felt a new wave of fear, but this time it was different. It was the fear of a soldier before a battle, not a victim before a predator. She was no longer alone. She had an ally. She had the full story. The weight of the secret was still immense, but now she was not carrying it by herself. "What do we do?" she asked, the question a quiet plea. Silas stood and walked to the window, peering out through a small gap in the curtains. "For now, we wait for dark. He'll make his move tonight. He's not going to risk you having another day to think, another day to talk to someone. Tonight, he'll send his men to get what he thinks you found, and to make sure you can't tell anyone about it." The afternoon sun bled away, the light turning from gold to orange to a deep, bruised purple. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Every minute that ticked by felt like an hour, stretching her nerves tighter and tighter. Silas was quiet, moving about his cabin with a grim purpose, checking the bolts on his door, cleaning a long-barreled shotgun with a steady, practiced hand that belied his age. The sight of the weapon was both terrifying and comforting. It was a statement that this was real, that the coming night held the promise of real violence. He made them a meal of thick stew and hard biscuits, and Helen forced herself to eat, knowing she would need the strength. Luke was quiet, his eyes wide, sensing the immense, unspoken tension in the room. He ate without complaint, huddled close to his mother's side. Sophie slept in a makeshift crib in the corner, blessedly unaware of the storm that was gathering outside their small wooden sanctuary. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire in the stove and the lonely sigh of the wind in the pines. Helen felt like she was trapped in the final moments before an execution. As true darkness fell, a deep, starless black that seemed to press against the window panes, Silas blew out the main lantern, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint orange glow from the stove's grate. "He'll come now," Silas whispered, his voice a low rumble from the shadows near the door. "They'll go to her cabin first. They won't expect her to have gone anywhere." The logic was cold and sound. Thorne saw her as a trapped, helpless animal. He would not anticipate her seeking help. The plan was terrifyingly simple. They would wait for Thorne's men to commit to breaking into Zelda's cabin. That would be their chance, their only chance. "We need the gold," Silas stated. "Not all of it, just one bar. Something tangible, something they can't deny. The diary is a story, but gold with the cooperative stamp on it, that's proof." The thought of returning to that cabin, of descending back into that dark cistern with Thorne's men closing in, made Helen's stomach churn with acid. But he was right. They needed the final piece of evidence. They needed the stone to chain to Thorne's neck. The waiting stretched into an eternity. Helen sat in the darkness, Sophie sleeping in her lap, Luke's small head resting on her shoulder. She could hear the frantic beating of her own heart, a wild drum in the suffocating silence. She strained her ears, listening for the sound of an engine, of footsteps, of anything that would signal the end of this agonizing suspense. The wind howled outside, a mournful, lonely sound that seemed to be weeping for what was to come. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie of her own life. This couldn't be real. Just weeks ago, her biggest problem was an eviction notice. Now she was huddled in a remote mountain cabin, allied with a reclusive survivor, waiting for a murderer's henchman to arrive under the cover of darkness. The sheer, insane trajectory of her life was impossible to comprehend. She clutched her children tighter, their warmth a fragile anchor in the cold, terrifying dark. They were the only thing that mattered. She would walk through fire for them, and it seemed, tonight, she would have to. Suddenly, from the direction of her cabin, a sound cut through the wind, a sharp, frantic series of barks. It wasn't Silas's old hound who remained silent by the porch. It was a different dog. Helen's mind flashed to the stray mutt she had seen a few times near Zelda's cabin, a skinny, timid creature she had given a few scraps of her own meager food. That stray was now her alarm system. Its barks were sharp, panicked, and insistent. Silas moved to the window, peering into the blackness. "They're there," he hissed. "Two of them. Flashlights." Helen's blood ran cold. It was happening. It was real. The barks were abruptly cut off by a sickening yelp, followed by a sudden, final silence. A wave of nausea and fury washed over Helen. They had killed the dog. That small act of casual cruelty told her everything she needed to know about the men who were now searching her cabin. There would be no mercy. There would be no negotiation. They were here to solve a problem, and she was the problem. The time for waiting was over. The time for running had begun. "Now," Silas whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "While they're busy in the cabin, we move. Go out the back. Don't make a sound. Get to the cistern, get one bar, and get back here. I'll be watching. If they move towards you, I'll create a diversion." The thought of going alone was paralyzing. "I can't leave the children," she breathed, her voice a knot of panic. "You have to," he countered, his tone hard but not unkind. "They'll be safer here with me than out there with you. They'll slow you down. Be quick, be quiet. Think of it like this. You're a ghost. You're Zelda's ghost, going back for one last piece of justice. Now go." His words, a strange mixture of command and poetry, shocked her into action. He was right. She kissed both her children, a frantic, desperate press of her lips on their foreheads, a silent promise that she would be back. Luke looked up at her, his eyes full of a terror that mirrored her own, but he nodded. A small, brave soldier. Silas handed her a small, dim flashlight. "Don't use it unless you have no other choice," he warned. "The moon is bright enough. Trust your eyes." Slipping out the back door of Silas's cabin was like stepping into a pool of ice-cold ink. The darkness was absolute, disorienting. She paused, letting her eyes adjust, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like it might break through. The moon was a sliver, casting a pale, ghostly light that made the woods a treacherous maze of shifting shadows and deep, black voids. She could see the faint, distant beams of flashlight sweeping back and forth through the trees, centered on Zelda's cabin. They were inside now, tearing it apart, searching for the secret they didn't know she had already found. She took a deep breath, the air frigid and sharp in her lungs, and began to run. She moved not on the path but through the trees, a ghost in the undergrowth, her feet silent on the soft bed of pine needles. The branches clawed at her face and clothes, unseen thorns tearing at her skin, but she didn't feel the pain. Her entire being was focused on one goal, the cistern. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig under her own feet, sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. She reached the edge of her clearing and dropped to the ground, her breath coming in painful, silent gasps. She peered through the bushes. The beams of two powerful flashlights were cutting through the darkness inside her cabin, sweeping across the walls, illuminating the dust motes in the air. She could hear the crash of furniture being overturned, the splintering of wood. They were angry, frustrated. They hadn't found anything. She knew she only had minutes, perhaps seconds, before they expanded their search outside. She crawled on her hands and knees towards the thicket that concealed the cistern, the damp earth cold and gritty under her palms. Her movements were agonizingly slow, her mind screaming at her to hurry while her body screamed for caution. She found the thicket, the thorns tearing at her jacket. She fumbled in the dark, her hands searching for the iron ring of the lid. Her fingers brushed against it, the metal colder than ice. Using every ounce of her strength, she began to slide the heavy lid aside, the grating sound of metal on stone seeming as loud as a thunderclap to her terrified ears. She didn't have time for the wire ladder. She had to jump. The thought was insane, a drop of 15 feet into absolute blackness, but the sound of a voice from the cabin, sharp and angry, spurred her on. "It ain't here. Let's check outside." She didn't hesitate. She swung her legs over the edge, took a final ragged breath and let go. The fall was a moment of pure, heart-stopping terror. She landed on the wooden platform with a jarring thud that sent a shockwave of pain up through her legs and spine. For a second, the world went black, the pain overwhelming her. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, the coppery taste of blood filling her mouth. She scrambled blindly towards the footlocker, her hands finding the cold metal. She flipped the latches, her fingers clumsy and numb, and lifted the lid. The faint, ghostly light from the opening above was just enough to see the dull gleam of the gold bars. She grabbed one. The weight of it was shocking, a dense, solid block of truth. She clutched it to her chest, a talisman against the evil that was now just feet above her head. The climb out was a nightmare. She couldn't use the wire. She had to find purchase in the rough-hewn stones of the cistern wall, her fingers raw and bleeding, her muscles screaming in protest. She could hear them now, right outside. Their heavy boots crunched on the leaves. The beams of their flashlights cut across the opening above her, casting fleeting, terrifying patterns of light and shadow down into her hiding place. "What's this thicket?" one of them grumbled. "Check it out." Her heart stopped. They were there. They were right there. She froze, plastered against the stone wall, the heavy gold bar clutched to her chest, not daring to breathe. She was trapped. This was it. They had found her. She closed her eyes, a silent prayer dying on her lips. The image of her children's faces flashed in her mind. This could not be the end, it could not. She had to get back to them. The beam of a flashlight shone directly down into the cistern, blinding her. She was caught. The light held on her, a single damning eye. This was the end of her run. Suddenly, a gunshot echoed through the forest, a loud, definitive crack that was completely different from the earlier yelp of the dog. It came from the direction of Silas's cabin. It was followed by a shout, a man's voice, full of rage and pain. The flashlight beam instantly snapped away from her, pointing back towards the sound. "What the hell was that?" the man above her yelled. "Go! Go see what that was." She heard the heavy crunch of footsteps running away from the cistern, back towards the main path. It was the diversion. Silas. He had drawn them away from her, saving her at the last possible second. She didn't waste the opportunity. Galvanized by a fresh surge of adrenaline, she scrambled the last few feet up the wall, her fingers finding cracks she hadn't seen before, and hauled herself over the edge, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for air. The gold bar felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She didn't look back. She didn't wait. She got to her feet and ran, a ghost carrying a block of stolen justice, melting back into the shadows of the woods, her only thought on the safety of the cabin where her children and her only ally waited. The run back to Silas's cabin was a blind, desperate flight. Her lungs burned, her legs were leaden, and the gold bar felt like it was trying to pull her down into the earth. She burst through the tree line into his clearing and practically fell against the back door, pounding on it with her free hand. It was wrenched open instantly, and Silas pulled her inside, bolting it behind her. She collapsed to the floor, the heavy gold bar thudding onto the wooden planks. Luke rushed to her, his small arms wrapping around her neck. "Mom, "You're back!" he cried, his voice thick with relief. Helen hugged him tightly, burying her face in his hair, her body shaking with a combination of exertion and residual terror. She had done it. She had faced the dragon in its lair and had stolen a single, golden scale. She looked at Silas, who was peering out the window, his shotgun held at the ready. "They took the bait," he said, his voice grim. "Headed back toward the main road, but they'll be back, and Thorn will be with them next time. We have to move now. We have to make the call." Silas moved with a speed that belied his age. He went to a far corner of the cabin, to a large wooden chest covered with a dusty blanket. He threw the blanket aside and lifted the lid, revealing not old clothes or tools, but a piece of equipment that seemed utterly alien in the rustic setting. An old military-grade ham radio. A web of wires ran from it up into the rafters. "My wife's brother, my nephew, Daniel," Silas explained as he began to turn dials, the radio crackling to life with a hiss of static. "He got out of these mountains, became a lawyer, then joined the FBI. He's a good man. He never believed the official story about his uncles. He's a federal agent in Charleston." Helen stared, dumbfounded. The reclusive old man, the forgotten survivor, had a direct line to the one authority Thorn couldn't control. It was the final, brilliant piece of Zelda's unwitting 40-year-old plan. It was the checkmate she had set up from beyond the grave. Her act of vengeance, hidden for decades, was about to be delivered not by a local sheriff, but by the full force of the federal government. The static hissed and popped as Silas adjusted the frequency, his gnarled fingers surprisingly deft on the controls. He put a pair of bulky headphones on and spoke into a microphone, his voice low and urgent. "Blackbird, this is Watcher. Do you copy, Blackbird? Come in, Blackbird." The code name sent a shiver down Helen's spine. This was a conversation they had rehearsed, a contingency they had planned for years. After a moment of agonizing silence, a voice, tinny and distant, crackled back through the speaker. "Watcher, this is Blackbird. I copy. It's been a long time. Is everything all right?" Silas leaned into the microphone, his voice tight with the gravity of the moment. "No, son, everything is not all right. It's time. The ghost has come home. I have her, and I have the proof, tangible proof. The man on the mountain knows we have it. He's made his move. We are in imminent danger. I repeat, imminent danger. It's time to come home, Daniel. It's time to bring the thunder." There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice came back, no longer tinny or distant, but hard, clear, and full of a cold professional fury. "I'm on my way." The promise of help of a force more powerful than Thorn did not bring relief. Instead, it brought a new, sharper kind of tension. The clock was ticking. The FBI was coming, but they were hours away. Thorn and his men were just minutes away. The night was far from over. Silas turned from the radio, his face grim. "They'll be back with a vengeance now," he said. "They know someone else is involved. They won't just be looking for a diary. They'll be looking to erase witnesses, to burn everything to the ground." The words "burn everything" hung in the air, a direct echo of Thorn's own threat. The small, sturdy cabin no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a tinderbox. They were trapped, caught between the approaching fury of the killer and the distant promise of justice. The final confrontation was coming. There was no more running, no more hiding. The battle for Zelda's legacy, for Thomas's stolen future, and for her own children's lives would be fought here, in this small wooden box, in the deep, dark heart of the Appalachian Mountains. The climax was no longer a threat. It was an inevitability, rushing towards them through the night. The silence in Silas's cabin was a thin, fragile membrane stretched over a drum of impending violence. Outside, the wind died down, and a new sound took its place. The deep, angry growl of Jedediah Thorn's truck engine, much closer this time. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a declaration of war. Helen held her breath, her hand clutching Luke's shoulder so tightly her knuckles were white. She could hear the crunch of heavy boots on gravel, more than 2 sets this time. A car door slammed with cold finality, then a sloshing sound, liquid being poured from a can, accompanied by a sharp, chemical odor that cut through the scent of pine and wood smoke. Gasoline. The smell of Thorn's promised accident filled her nostrils, thick and nauseating. She felt a tremor run through her body, a violent, uncontrollable shudder of pure terror. Through a tiny crack in the curtain, she saw the silhouette of Thorn himself, his posture radiating impatient fury as he held a small, metallic object that glinted in the moonlight. A lighter. The end was here, a single spark away. Just as Thorn raised the lighter, its flint wheel poised to create the spark that would engulf her past and future in flames, the night erupted, not with fire, but with light and sound. Powerful, blindingly white beams cut through the darkness from all directions, pinning Thorn and his two henchmen like insects on a board. The forest itself seemed to come alive with silent, dark figures emerging from the trees, clad in tactical gear, weapons held at the ready. An authoritative voice, amplified and inescapable, ripped through the silence. "FBI! Drop the lighter! Hands in the air! Now!" Thorn froze, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. For the first time in his life, the man who controlled everything was no longer in control. His arrogance crumbled, replaced by the feral panic of a cornered animal. The small metal lighter, the instrument of his final, brutal act, slipped from his numb fingers and clattered onto the gravel with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the sudden, charged stillness. The game was over. The takedown was a blur of swift, brutal efficiency. Before Thorn could even process his disbelief, two agents were on him, forcing him to his knees in the gasoline-soaked dirt. The cold, sharp click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed in the clearing, a sound of finality, of a debt 40 years overdue finally being called in. His henchmen, seeing the overwhelming force that had materialized from the shadows, dropped their own weapons and surrendered without a fight, their bluster evaporating into pathetic whimpers. From the window of Silas's cabin, Helen watched the Titan fall. The man whose shadow had terrorized an entire generation, the monster from Zelda's diary, was now just a man on his knees, his expensive jacket stained with mud and gasoline, his face illuminated in the harsh glare of the flashlights. A sob, not of fear or grief, but of profound, earth-shattering relief, finally broke free from her chest. Her legs gave out, and she slid to the floor, the tension of the last few days draining from her in a dizzying, liberating flood. It was over. The cabin door opened, and a tall man in an FBI jacket stepped inside. He was young, his face professional and serious, but he had Silas's piercing blue eyes. He looked at the old man, and a lifetime of shared history and unspoken grief passed between them in a single glance. "Uncle Silas," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Then he turned to Helen, his expression softening with respect. "You must be Helen. I'm Daniel." Helen, still trembling, slowly got to her feet. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the two items that had started it all, the cracked leather diary and the single, heavy gold bar. She placed them on the table between them. The gold bar no longer felt like a curse, it felt like a key. Daniel picked up the diary first, handling it with a reverence that spoke volumes. Then he lifted the gold bar, feeling its impossible weight, his eyes finding the small, embossed insignia of the Appalachian Miners Cooperative. "My grandfather's mark," he whispered, his voice choked. "All these years, mad, it was real." The evidence was no longer a story, it was a federal case. The weeks that followed were a surreal whirlwind. Helen and her children were moved to a secure location in Charleston as a federal investigation, of a scale the state had never seen unrolled with unstoppable momentum. She gave her testimony in a quiet, sterile room, her voice steady as she recounted every detail. With Daniel and a compassionate federal prosecutor by her side, Zelda's diary was the roadmap, Silas's testimony was the living history, and the gold bar was the undeniable physical proof. News reports exploded, first with the shocking arrest of the untouchable Jedediah Thorn, then with the slow, horrifying unraveling of the 40-year-old conspiracy. Thorn's empire of fear began to crumble. Armed with the new evidence, investigators reopened old cases, and a flood of stories, long suppressed by fear, began to pour out from the mountain communities, tales of extortion, intimidation, and other accidents. Thorn's one act of murderous greed had been the cornerstone of a lifetime of corruption, and now that stone had been pulled loose. The FBI, guided by the diary, descended back into the cistern and recovered the footlocker. the image of the chest, filled with the dull gleam of gold, being hoisted into the daylight, was broadcast across the nation. But the most damning discovery came weeks later. Following Silas's account, excavation teams broke the dynamite seal on the old cooperative mine. Inside, they found what was left of 11 men, their bodies entombed for 4 decades. The mining accident was officially declared a mass murder. Jedediah Thorne, facing irrefutable evidence of multiple counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and a host of financial crimes, would never see the outside of a prison cell again. The corrupt local sheriff was arrested, and the town Thorne had held in his grip for so long took its first shuddering breath of free air. The ghost story of the massacred miners became a legend of justice, and Zelda Forrester, the quiet cook, became a folk hero, her patient vengeance finally complete. The legal system then turned its attention to the fortune in gold. In a landmark ruling, the court declared that since the miners' cooperative was defunct, with no living members besides Silas and no direct heirs, the recovered assets were subject to reward. As the sole legal heir of Zelda Forrester, who had performed the initial recovery of the stolen property, and as the individual whose direct actions and discovery led to the resolution of a major criminal case, Helen was awarded definitive, clear title to Zelda's land and a staggering percentage of the gold's total assessed value. The call from the federal prosecutor was a universe away from the first lawyer's call she had received. There was no cold impersonality, only warmth and deep respect. The number he quoted was so large, so astronomical, that she had to sit down. It was a figure that didn't just promise an escape from poverty, it promised a new world, a new life, a future so bright it was impossible to imagine. The weight of $27 was lifted, replaced by a security so absolute it felt like a dream. 1 year later, the sun shone down on the same small plot of land high in the Appalachian Mountains. The air was clean and smelled of fresh-cut pine and sawdust. Zelda's dilapidated, rotting cabin was gone, every trace of its misery erased from the earth. In its place, a beautiful, modern home with large windows and a wide and welcoming porch was nearing completion. The sound that filled the air was not the groan of decaying wood or the desperate sound of a child's cough, but the confident hum of power saws and the easy laughter of the construction crew. Helen stood on the porch, a mug of hot coffee warming her hands, watching the final trusses of the roof being set in place. Her face was no longer gaunt with hunger and fear. It was healthy, calm, and filled with a quiet strength. She was not just building a house, she was building a sanctuary, a fortress of peace on the ground where she had once found only despair. The mountains, once a symbol of hostile isolation, now felt like protective, sleeping giants guarding her new life. Inside the finished part of the house, in a bright room filled with sunlight, a new sound provided a gentle rhythm to the day, the happy, steady hum of a brand-new sewing machine. Helen sat, not frantically mending rags, but joyfully creating a colorful quilt, her hands, once calloused with desperation, now moving with creative purpose. Luke, now a healthy, boisterous 11-year-old, burst through the door, his clothes muddy and his face beaming, shouting about a frog he had found by the creek. Sophie, a happy, babbling toddler, chased after him, her small feet steady on the warm, solid hardwood floor. Later, Helen stood in a modern kitchen, filled with the aroma of a roasting chicken. She looked at her children, safe, warm, and laughing at a dinner table laden with more food than they could possibly eat. The gnawing emptiness in her stomach was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep sense of peace. She had not only survived, she had triumphed. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, and a new, hopeful future had finally, truly, begun. Her life, once defined by the weight of $27 and the suffocating grip of despair, was now a testament to a strength she never knew she possessed. She had honored the lonely courage of Zelda May Forrester and had delivered the justice Thomas and his friends had been denied for so long. Looking out her new window at the vast, peaceful expanse of the mountains, she understood that she had not inherited a ruin, but a responsibility, and in fulfilling it, she had found her own redemption. What did you think of Helen's journey from the depths of poverty to the heights of justice? If you believe that even the most deeply buried secrets must come to light, and that the fierce love of a mother can overcome any obstacle, Subscribe to our channel for more stories of incredible resilience and ultimate triumph.